The scorching sun blazed mercilessly over the cracked earth of Khaemwaset's farm, where once green fields now lay barren and lifeless. For 3 moons, not a single drop of rain had blessed the land, and the mighty Nile's waters had receded far beyond reach. The farmer knelt among the withered stalks of what should have been his harvest, his calloused hands trembling as he held the last handful of grain from his dwindling stores. His wife Nefertiti lay weakening in their mud brick home, their 3 children growing thinner with each passing day. The youngest, little Amenhotep, had stopped crying from hunger, a silence that terrified Khaemwaset more than any storm. What do you do when the gods seem to have abandoned you? This question haunted every step as Khaemwaset made his desperate journey toward the great temple of Aten in Amarna, the revolutionary capital built by Pharaoh Akhenaten. The golden rays of the sun God should have brought life, but instead they seemed to mock his suffering. In his worn leather pouch, he carried his family's last precious grains, barely enough to feed them for 2 days, yet all he could offer to the almighty Aten in hopes of divine intervention. The temple rose before him like a mountain of white limestone, its towering columns reaching toward the heavens where surely the god dwelt. Hundreds of pilgrims crowded the vast courtyard, their voices rising in prayers and supplications. Rich merchants offered golden jewelry and exotic spices, while nobles presented fine linens and precious stones. Khaemwaset's humble offering seemed pathetic in comparison, but his faith burned brighter than the desert sun. He had walked for 2 days without food, his feet bleeding through worn sandals, driven by a father's desperate love and unwavering belief that the gods would hear his plea. As he approached the temple steps, his heart pounded with both hope and terror. The priests in their pristine white robes moved like celestial beings among the crowd, their heads shaved and gleaming with sacred oils. This was his moment, his chance to save his family or watch them perish. The weight of their lives pressed upon his shoulders as he clutched his meager offering and whispered a silent prayer. Today would determine whether the gods truly cared for the suffering of their children, or if divine mercy was reserved only for those who could afford it. Little did he know that his humble petition would soon ignite a confrontation that would echo through the halls of power and change the very nature of religious authority in the kingdom. The High Priest Amenhotep stood atop the marble steps like a golden statue, his elaborate headdress catching the afternoon light as his cold eyes surveyed the gathering crowd. When Khaemwaset approached with trembling steps, the priest's lip curled in undisguised disgust. The farmer's sun-darkened skin, patched tunic, and dusty appearance marked him immediately as one of the lowly peasants, hardly worthy of divine attention. As Khaemwaset knelt and opened his leather pouch, revealing his modest offering of grain, a ripple of laughter began to spread through the assembled worshippers. "Behold!" Amenhotep's voice boomed across the courtyard, his arms spreading wide in theatrical mockery. "Another beggar comes before the mighty Aten with scraps and expects miracles." The crowd's laughter grew louder, emboldening the priest to continue his cruel performance. He picked up a few grains from Khaemwaset's offering and let them fall through his fingers like worthless dust. "Do you think the god of the sun, creator of all Egypt, desires your pitiful crumbs? The divine Aten deserves gold, precious stones, fine incense, not the desperate offerings of those too lazy to prosper." Khaemwaset's face burned with shame, but he remained on his knees, his voice barely a whisper as he tried to explain his family's dire situation. The priest, however, was just beginning his public humiliation. "Listen well, you wretched farmers," Amenhotep addressed the crowd while pointing accusingly at Khaemwaset. "This man's poverty is proof of divine displeasure. The gods bless the righteous with abundance and curse the wicked with want. His suffering is his own doing, a reflection of his spiritual inadequacy." The wealthy merchants and nobles in the crowd nodded approvingly, their silk garments rustling as they murmured agreement with the priest's harsh words. Some threw small stones at Khaemwaset's feet, others spat in his direction. The farmer's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs as he thought of his dying wife and starving children waiting at home. Was this truly the will of the gods? Had his faith been nothing but foolish delusion? "Guards!" Amenhotep commanded with a theatrical flourish. "Remove this pestilence from our sacred space. Let him learn that the temple of Aten is for the worthy, not for beggars who would pollute our holy ground with their presence." Two massive temple guards stepped forward, their bronze weapons gleaming menacingly. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, thoroughly entertained by the spectacle of the poor man's degradation. As the guards reached for him, Khaemwaset looked up one last time at the golden image of Aten above the temple entrance. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as his last hope crumbled to dust. The god he had served faithfully all his life seemed as distant and uncaring as the priest who claimed to speak in his name. The laughter of the crowd rang in his ears like the cackling of demons, and for a moment, his faith wavered completely. Perhaps the priest was right. Perhaps his suffering was divine punishment for some unknown sin. The bitter taste of despair filled his mouth as he prepared to leave in defeat, his family's death sentence sealed by religious cruelty and social indifference. Among the jeering crowd, one figure remained perfectly still, his jaw clenched tight as he witnessed the unfolding cruelty. Dressed in simple brown robes, with a common worker's headwrap pulled low over his features, he appeared to be just another face in the multitude. But beneath the humble disguise, Pharaoh Akhenaten's eyes burned with rising fury. This was not his first time walking anonymously among his people. He had made it a practice to observe the true state of his kingdom without the filter of royal courtiers and advisors. What he saw today shattered something deep within his soul. This was not the religion he had envisioned when he revolutionized Egypt's spiritual practices and established the worship of Aten as the one true God. His reforms were meant to bring compassion, truth, and justice, not create a new class of arrogant priests who wielded divine authority like a weapon against the helpless. The irony cut like a blade. His own religious revolution was being corrupted by the very human vices he had sought to eliminate. The disguised pharaoh watched as Khaemwaset's faith crumbled before the priest's theatrical cruelty, and something ancient and powerful stirred within him, the same righteous anger that had driven him to challenge the old gods and their corrupt priesthood years ago. But this time, the corruption bore his own name, flourished under his own religious banner. The responsibility weighed heavier than any crown. As the crowd's laughter reached a crescendo, Akhenaten studied their faces with growing disgust. These were his people, merchants who cheated farmers, nobles who exploited the poor, wealthy citizens who found entertainment in another's suffering. Their expensive jewelry glittered in the sunlight while they mocked a starving man's desperate plea for help. When had Egypt become a nation where compassion was seen as weakness and cruelty as divine righteousness? The pharaoh's hands clenched into fists beneath his simple robes as he remembered his own teachings about Aten, the god of light, truth, and universal love. He had proclaimed that the sun god's rays blessed all living creatures equally, that divine love knew no boundaries of class or wealth. Yet here stood a priest, claiming to speak for Aten, while embodying everything the god opposed. The blasphemy was unbearable. But what struck Akhenaten most deeply was the broken faith in Khaemwaset's eyes, the moment when a righteous man began to doubt the very existence of divine justice. This was more than social cruelty. It was spiritual murder. The priest wasn't just humiliating a poor farmer, he was destroying the sacred bond between a believer and his God, replacing divine love with human hatred, celestial compassion with earthly arrogance. As the guards moved toward the kneeling farmer, the disguised pharaoh felt the weight of divine responsibility settle upon his shoulders. He had not come here as a king today, but the gods, or perhaps the god his beloved Aten, had placed him here as a witness to this injustice. Sometimes the most unexpected moments demand the most profound acts of courage. The crowd around him continued their cruel celebration, unaware that the most powerful man in Egypt stood among them, and that their entertainment was about to become their education. Divine intervention, he realized, sometimes wore the face of earthly authority, refusing to remain silent. The single word erupted from the crowd like thunder splitting the desert sky. "Enough!" The voice carried such commanding authority that every laugh died instantly. Every conversation ceased, and even the guards froze mid-step. The sound reverberated off the temple walls with an almost supernatural power, as if the very stones themselves had cried out against the injustice being perpetrated within their sacred confines. A tall figure emerged from the throng of worshippers, his simple brown robes seeming to transform before their eyes into garments of quiet majesty. Though his face remained partially concealed by his headwrap, there was something in his bearing, something in the way he moved with absolute confidence through the suddenly silent crowd, that made hardened warriors step aside instinctively. Akhenaten's eyes blazed with righteous fury as he approached the temple steps, each footfall echoing like a drum of judgment. High Priest Amenhotep, still drunk on his own performance and the crowd's earlier approval, sneered at this unexpected interruption. "Who dares interrupt the sacred proceedings of this temple? Guards, remove this insolent fool who would challenge divine authority." But even as he spoke, something in the stranger's presence gave him pause. The man's silence was more powerful than any shout, his stillness more commanding than any gesture. "Divine authority?" Akhenaten's voice was quiet now, but it carried to every corner of the vast courtyard. "Is this what you call divine authority, priest? Mocking the desperate prayers of a faithful man? Finding entertainment in the suffering of the innocent?" He gestured toward the still kneeling Khaemwaset, whose tear-stained face looked up in wonder at his unexpected defender. "Tell me, servant of Aten, where in your sacred teachings does it say that the god's love is measured by the weight of gold in a man's purse?" The priest's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. This common peasant was making him look foolish before the assembled crowd, challenging his interpretation of divine will. "How dare you question the wisdom of Aten's chosen servant? I speak with the authority of the god himself. This man's poverty is proof of divine displeasure. The gods bless the righteous and curse the wicked. The gods bless the righteous." Akhenaten stepped closer, his voice rising with each word. "Then tell me, priest, why do you live in luxury while faithful servants of Aten starve in the fields that feed your temple? Why do you adorn yourself with gold while those who truly labor in the god's name wear rags? If poverty indicates divine displeasure, what does your wealth indicate about your own righteousness?" The crowd began to murmur uncertainly. This stranger's words carried a weight that made them uncomfortable, forcing them to examine their own consciences. Some of the merchants shifted nervously, remembering their own dealings with struggling farmers. The nobles found themselves looking away from the scene, unwilling to meet the penetrating gaze of this mysterious defender of the poor. Amenhotep sputtered with rage, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. "You speak blasphemy. The temple's wealth is sacred, dedicated to the glory of Aten. Who are you to question centuries of religious tradition?" But even as he spoke, he could feel his authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. This stranger commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with priestly robes or golden ornaments. His power came from something far deeper and more authentic. "I am someone who remembers what Aten truly represents," Akhenaten replied, his voice now carrying an otherworldly resonance. "The god of light, whose rays shine equally upon rich and poor, whose love knows no boundaries of class or station. This man kneels before you not as a beggar, but as a child of the divine light, seeking help from those who claim to serve that same light, and you respond with cruelty." With a deliberate movement that seemed to slow time itself, Akhenaten reached up and pulled away his simple headwrap, revealing the unmistakable features that graced every statue and relief throughout the kingdom. The elongated face, the distinctive jawline, the eyes that had gazed down from temple walls for over a decade, the face of the living God-King of Egypt stood before them in humble brown robes. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow, sending gasps of terror and amazement rippling through the assembly. High Priest Amenhotep's face went white as limestone, his knees buckling as the full magnitude of his situation crashed down upon him. He had just lectured, contradicted, and challenged the divine Pharaoh himself, the very man who had appointed him to his position, who could end his life with a single word. "My lord," he stammered, falling prostrate on the temple steps, his previous arrogance evaporating like morning mist. "Forgive your humble servant. I did not recognize..." "You did not recognize your Pharaoh?" Akhenaten's voice carried across the courtyard with devastating calm. "Or did you not recognize the teachings of compassion that form the very foundation of our faith?" He moved past the groveling priest and knelt beside Khaemwaset, who stared in disbelief at the divine ruler treating him as an equal. "Rise, faithful servant of Aten. Your God has heard your prayers, though his supposed earthly representatives have failed you." The transformation in the courtyard was absolute. Moments before, the crowd had been laughing at Khaemwaset's humiliation. Now they watched in stunned silence as their pharaoh helped the poor farmer to his feet with his own royal hands. The wealthy merchants who had thrown stones now trembled, realizing they had mocked a man defended by their king. The nobles who had jeered found themselves unable to meet Akhenaten's penetrating gaze. "Behold the true face of faith," Akhenaten announced, his arm around Khaemwaset's shoulders. "This man walked for days without food, carrying his family's last grains, not for himself, but as an offering to the divine. He came here not demanding riches, but humbly requesting help to save his loved one. His poverty speaks not of divine displeasure, but of a broken system that has forgotten its sacred duty to protect the vulnerable." The pharaoh turned to face Amenhotep, who remained prostrate on the marble steps. "You speak of divine authority, priest, while wielding it like a weapon against those who need divine mercy most. You live in luxury, built on the suffering of those you should serve. You have turned my temple into a marketplace where divine favor is sold to the highest bidder and denied to the desperate." Khaemwaset found his voice for the first time since entering the temple. "My lord Pharaoh," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I did not know. I would never have dared to approach if I had realized." "That is exactly why I am here," Akhenaten replied gently. "Because you did not know. Because you came seeking help from what you believed was the house of God, only to find it had become a den of cruelty. Your honest faith has exposed the rot that has infected my own religious reforms." The pharaoh's voice rose again, addressing the entire assembly. "Let this moment serve as a lesson to all who witness it. True religion is not measured by the gold in our temples or the fine robes of our priests. It is measured by our compassion for the suffering, our willingness to lift up the fallen, our dedication to justice for all, not just those who can afford it." He gestured toward the cowering priest. "This man has forgotten that divine authority exists to serve, not to oppress. That religious power should heal, not wound. That the God's love flows most freely to those who need it most desperately." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, every person present understood they were witnessing more than a political confrontation. They were seeing the birth of a new understanding of what true spirituality meant in the kingdom of Egypt. Akhenaten's gaze swept across the assembled crowd one final time before he turned his attention to the immediate task of justice. "Guards," he commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority, "escort former High Priest Amenhotep from these sacred grounds. He is hereby stripped of all religious titles and temple privileges. Let him learn what it means to depend on the mercy of others, as he should have learned to show mercy to those who depended on him." The guards, who moments before had been ready to eject Khaemwaset from the temple, now moved swiftly to remove the disgraced priest. Amenhotep's pleas for forgiveness fell on deaf ears as he was led away, his elaborate robes and golden ornaments suddenly seeming like costumes from a cruel play that had finally ended. The crowd watched in fascination as the man who had wielded religious authority like a sword found himself powerless before true justice. But Akhenaten was far from finished. He called forth the temple treasurer, a nervous scribe who had witnessed the entire confrontation with growing alarm. "Open the temple vaults," the pharaoh commanded. "Bring forth grain, oil, and silver, enough to sustain Khaemwaset's family through the next harvest season. And do not stop with him alone. I want you to identify every farming family in the surrounding districts who suffers from this drought. The temple's wealth shall flow to those who need it most, as it should have been doing all along." Khaemwaset fell to his knees again, but this time not in desperation, in overwhelming gratitude. Tears of joy streamed down his weathered face as he realized his family would not only survive, but thrive. The nightmare that had haunted his sleep for months was ending in a way he never could have imagined. "My Lord Pharaoh," he whispered, "how can I ever repay such kindness?" "By living," Akhenaten replied simply, helping the farmer to his feet once more. "By raising your children to understand that true strength lies in compassion, that real power serves others rather than itself. Return to your fields not as a beggar who was granted charity, but as a man whose faith was rewarded by divine justice working through earthly hands." The pharaoh then addressed the crowd, many of whom still stood in stunned silence, processing the dramatic reversal they had witnessed. "Let today's events be recorded and proclaimed throughout the kingdom. From this day forward, all temples dedicated to Aten will reserve half their income for the direct assistance of the poor, the sick, and the struggling. Religious authority that does not serve the people serves nothing sacred at all." He appointed a new high priest from among the younger temple scribes, a man known for his genuine piety and humble service, rather than political ambition. "Your first duty," Akhenaten instructed him, "is to ensure that no faithful person ever leaves this temple feeling abandoned by their God. The doors of this sacred place shall remain open to all, regardless of their ability to offer golden treasures." As the afternoon sun began to set, painting the temple walls in shades of gold and crimson, Akhenaten walked with Khaemwaset toward the temple entrance. The crowd parted before them like water, many bowing deeply as their pharaoh passed. But others, particularly the wealthy merchants and nobles who had participated in the earlier mockery, shifted uncomfortably, realizing their own behavior had been observed and judged by the highest authority in the land. "Tell me, Khaemwaset," the pharaoh said as they reached the temple steps, "what will you tell your wife and children about today?" The farmer considered the question carefully. "I will tell them that the gods do hear the prayers of the faithful, my lord. But more than that, I will tell them that sometimes divine justice wears the face of earthly courage. The courage to stand up and say, 'Enough,' when cruelty masquerades as righteousness." Akhenaten smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face since witnessing the original injustice. "And I will remember this day as the moment when my religious reforms truly began, not in the palaces and planning chambers, but here, in defending one man's desperate faith against the corruption that threatened to destroy it." As Khaemwaset departed with his newfound abundance, heading home to save his family and restore his fields, the echoes of transformation rippled outward from the temple. Word of the pharaoh's intervention would spread throughout Egypt, carrying with it a new understanding of what divine authority truly meant, not the power to oppress, but the responsibility to protect, not the privilege to judge, but the duty to serve. The age of compassionate spirituality had begun, born from one man's refusal to remain silent in the face of injustice.